Hi there and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Ashley Koziancic. I'm the owner of Studio Noir and the creator of Studio Noir Permanent Makeup Academy. I am a cosmetic tattoo artist specializing in lip blush, and I am based out of Kelowna, Canada. I wanted to create this video for those of you who might be struggling purchasing or choosing a tattoo machine, or you don't know which needles you should be using for your clients and why. You should be aware of what tools you are using and how they actually affect your work. I really wish that there was a video like this when I was looking at purchasing a new machine for my business. The courses that I took barely even scratched the surface, and in my opinion, having the correct tools to work with is one of the most important parts of the permanent makeup procedure. You want to know what you are purchasing. Don't just go out and purchase any gun because your favorite artist told you what they use is the best. Just a quick disclaimer, this video is not sponsored in any way. Everything that I talk about when it comes to guns and needles are my personal favorites, and it's what I use. I want to help you do your own research and help you choose your own favorites. That is the purpose of this video. So the first thing that you want to know when you're purchasing a machine is the stroke. The stroke of the gun refers to the distance the needle travels in and out of the cartridge. The smaller the stroke, the less distance the needle needs to travel in and out, and the higher the stroke, the farther the needle needs to travel in and out. Tattoo and permanent makeup machines come in either short, medium, or long stroke. Short stroke machines are normally 1.8 to 2.5. So if the machine was 1.8 millimeter stroke, the needle travels 0.9 millimeters in and 0.9 millimeters out of the machine. Medium stroke machines are typically 3 to 3.5. With a 3.5 millimeter stroke, the needle will be traveling 1.75 millimeters in and 1.75 millimeters out. And with a long stroke machine, they're typically anything above a 4.0. This is extremely important when you're buying a machine because the stroke is what is going to determine how hard the needle hits the skin. So with a short stroke machine, the needle doesn't retract back far enough. And because of this, I would recommend starting with this machine, especially if you're working on softer tissues and like lip skin, or if you're a beginner. You also want to keep in mind that when you are working with a short stroke machine, it can create a little bit of difficulty, especially when you're trying to puncture the skin, because the needle doesn't retract back far enough. It doesn't hit the skin as hard, so it's not as powerful. So you might actually find that a short stroke machine is more difficult to tattoo with for some clients and a little bit less versatile than a medium or long stroke machine. Longer stroke machines are normally recommended for brows, as face skin is a little bit thicker than lip skin, but this isn't always the case. If you're someone like me who likes to use a harder hitting machine for lips, then you would need to be able to adjust your technique for every client. If you're working on someone who has thinner lip tissue or you have a mature client, you want to be able to adjust your pressure. Pressure is the force that's actually applied with your hand, and if you're using a longer stroke machine, the needle will be hitting the skin with more force as the needle is retracting back more. That is why you want to use a lighter pressure. The movement of the needle in and out of the gun is the work. You don't need to be applying a bunch of pressure and digging the pigment into your client's skin. This is just going to cause unnecessary trauma, and the healed results will just look fake and chalky. So if you're a beginner artist, don't just go out and purchase a $1,000+ machine that you know nothing about just because your favorite artist uses it. I would honestly do your research, and like I had mentioned before, maybe try using a shorter stroke device until you at least have a little bit of practice. A shorter stroke will cause less trauma because it's not hitting the skin with the same amount of force as a longer stroke machine. When you're a beginner, you tend to have a little bit of a heavier hand. So my favorite machines to work with is the Bishop Wand Shader, which is this machine. It is a 3.5 stroke machine, and it is my go-to machine for lips and brows. If I have a client with mature skin, I normally will just adjust my technique, but sometimes I will go for something that's a shorter stroke and a little bit softer, and that would be the Mass Tour. I know it says online that this gun is a 3.5 stroke, but in my experience from using it, this is definitely hitting the skin more like a shorter stroke. Some popular guns that I would recommend for each stroke would be, for short stroke, the Bel Air, the Zion S 1.8 to 1.25. the Mass Maggie 2.5, Mass Tour, and the Leox Soft. For medium stroke, I would recommend the Mass Maggie 3.0, Leox Hard, the Mass P10, the Zion 3.0, and the Bishop 1 shader. And then for long stroke, I would recommend the Zion S 3.7, the Cheyenne Hawk, the Flux S, the Cheyenne Solterra, and the Bishop 1 packer. Another thing that is important when you're choosing a machine is you want to know how it's powered. I personally like working with a wireless machine. It's more convenient, and if you're clumsy like me, the last thing that you want to be doing is tripping on a cord or catching it on anything while you're working. If you do purchase a machine, make sure that it has a compatible battery. If you have to purchase it separately, the battery may come in an RCA or a DC jack, so you need to make sure that the gun and the battery are compatible. For example, my Bishop gun comes with an RCA compatible battery, and I had to purchase the battery separately. So you just want to make sure that these things are lining up, otherwise obviously it's not going to work in your gun. If your gun isn't wireless, you will have a cord that is hooked to a power source. So this is a power block, and it regulates the amount of electrical current coming from the outlet into your machine so you don't fry your tattoo gun. It also controls the voltage or the speed of the machine. Make sure the power block that you choose is compatible with your gun if it's not supplied with your purchase. Like I mentioned before, I work with a wireless gun and battery. The voltage is controlled with these buttons on the top of the battery. And my gun has a voltage range of 4 to 12 volts. The higher the voltage, the faster the machine goes. So basically, the faster the needle will go in and out of the cartridge. And then the slower that the machine goes, the slower the needle moves in and out of the cartridge. If you already have a wireless machine or battery, and it only shows numbers like speed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever, I would personally recommend buying a machine with a battery source that will actually show you the exact voltage that your machine is working on. The next thing that I want to discuss is needles and what you should be looking for when you're purchasing them, and how to properly read the needle configurations. And I want to also tell you which needles are my favorite. First things first, any needle that you are purchasing should have a membrane which prevents the backflow of any ink or bodily fluids. This is super important as it helps to prevent cross-contamination, and every needle that you are using should have this to be approved for use. When purchasing needles, you will need to know how to properly understand and read the needle configurations. This is important as different needle configurations will create different looks, and it will control how much pigment that you are depositing into the skin. The needle diameter is measured through one side of the needle to the other at its widest point before the needle starts to taper. It is important to know what the diameter you are using is, because it directly affects how the ink will flow into the area being tattooed. The smaller and finer the needle, the less ink that will flow, and the bigger the needle, the more ink that will flow. The bigger the needle will increase the rate of ink flow, so the more ink that will be carried out of the cartridge. So if you struggle with saturation, your needle size could be part of the problem. Needle count refers to the number of needles that are grouped together in a configuration. Needle configuration refers to how the needles are arranged. In tattooing, they are usually grouped into 3 main categories based on their formation, and that is round, magnum, and flat needles. These categories are then subdivided into liner and shader needles. There's a notable distinction between liner and shader needles based on their purpose. Liner needles are closely packed together, and this allows for very dense and precise lines. Also, really dense shading. Shading needles, on the other hand, are spaced further apart, and this makes them more suitable for broader shading techniques. The last thing that you want to know in the configuration is taper, and that is the distance of the needle tip from its widest part as it starts to taper to the sharpest point of the needle. Depending on its length, this will determine the type of taper the needle has and its use. How you would figure that out is through the taper measurements. Taper measurements can be defined in 3. There will be short, medium, and long. Medium taper is usually 2.5 in length, and long taper is usually 3.5, while extra long taper is usually a 5.5 or longer. The longer the taper, the sharper the point of the needle. In permanent makeup, you want the results to be very airy with small pixels, and you want to have greater control over the application. This is why you want to choose a long or extra long tapered needle. It's not like tattooing where you want to use a shorter taper where you'll be packing in the color. Shorter tapers also result in bigger pixels. So here's an example of 2 different types of needles. One is Quadrant, which is a permanent makeup needle, and then the other one are Bishop. These ones are tattoo needles. You can see that the numbers on each of the boxes are slightly different. On the Quadrant box, you can see that it says 253 RL-LT. And then on the Bishop box, it says 0803 RL-LT. If we look at the Quadrant needles, the 0.25 refers to the diameter. The smaller the number, the smaller the diameter. So if you have a 0.18, it will be smaller versus a 0.30. In permanent makeup, you usually need to use a needle that's anywhere from a 0.18 to 0.35. The 3 refers to the number of needles that are grouped together. So the 3 is the needles in this configuration. The smaller the number, the less needles are in the configuration, and the higher the number, the more there will be. Next, there is the RL, which is how the needles are grouped together. So RL stands for round liner. The needles will be grouped very tightly together, and then the LT stands for long taper. When looking at tattoo needles, there will be a slight difference. Here on this configuration, it reads 0803 RL-LT. Tattoo needles widely use a gauge number to indicate the diameter, and it's the exact same thing. So the 08 that is in this configuration means it's a 0.25 needle diameter. If the number was a 10 or a 00, that would mean that the diameter is a 0.30. So if you don't understand these when you're purchasing needles, just make sure that you're looking it up online. You want to make sure that you are purchasing the exact needles that you are wanting, especially when it comes to diameter. Here is another example. This is a Magnum needle, which is a permanent makeup needle, and this is how you would read the configuration. So on the box, it says 0.25. So again, that would be the needle diameter. Then it says 7. So there are 7 needles in that configuration. And then the CM stands for curved magnum. So that means that the needles are curved and it's a magnum needle. So there are 7 needles. And then there is the LT, which stands for long taper. So here's another example. If you read this box, it says 1RL20. And then here it says that it's a 1 round liner. So the 20 would be the diameter, and it doesn't list whether or not it's a long taper, but I imagine that if you buy this online, you will notice that it says whether or not it's a long taper. Now that you know how to read the boxes of your needles, how do you know which needles that you should be using? When it comes to the needles that you are using, it's important to note that the smaller the needle diameter and the configuration and the longer the taper, the more trauma that you will be causing to your client's skin. So if you have anyone who has dark lips or mature and thinner skin, you want to make sure that you are using a bigger needle configuration. This is because mature lips and people with thinner skin are more delicate, and this goes for working with brows as well. When you're working with dark lips, if you cause too much trauma, this can lead to hyper or hypopigmentation, which I have discussed in my color theory video. For these types of clients, I wouldn't use needles that are anywhere between a 0.18 to a 0.251 RL, especially if you're doing any shading. Instead, I would opt for a bigger needle like a 0.25, 0.303 RL, 0.25, 0.30, 5RL, 5RS, or 5 curved magnum. And for darker lips, I would use something even bigger, probably a 0.25 7 curved magnum. Also note that not all needle companies are created equally. My favorite needles to work with that I find penetrate the skin the best are the Vertex micro needles. These ones are my favorite, especially for lining, and I usually use a 0.201 RLLT. Sometimes I will use a 0.25. Then for shading, I will typically go for a quadrant needle, and this is the Quadrant Optima, so the pink and white box, and I will use the 0.25 3RLLT. Another few favorites of mine will be the Dragon Hawk needles. I really like those for the liners as well. So I will use the 0.25, 0.20, 1RLLT. I will also use their 3RLs. And I do use Tina Davies, but when I use their needles, I usually go for the 5RS, and it would be a 0.25 or the 7 curved magnum. So before we move on, the last thing that I want to mention when buying a tattoo machine is you want to make sure that the gun that you are purchasing takes universal needles. So it has universal needle compatibility. You don't want to be restricted to only being able to use certain needles, because that will just make it hard when you're purchasing your equipment. So the last thing that I want to discuss in this video is technique. I will be showing you how to properly position your body and your hands and how you should be using your tools effectively, because this will make up 30% of the permanent makeup procedure. So we will be getting into how long and short stroke devices look when you're shading. So I'm going to be using a 1RL needle by Vertex, and I will be using my Bishop wand shader to show you body and hand positioning. When it comes to the speed, I personally like to use a 4.5 to 6 for lips, depending on the client, and a 5 to 7.5 for brows. When we are shading, the speed of our machine will dictate how fast your hand should be moving while you're tattooing. So if your machine is on a 4.5, which is a lower speed, the needle will be coming in and out of the machine at a slower rate. So you wanna make sure that your hand and your needle speed are matching. So if you're on a higher speed, like a 6.5, the needle is going to be coming in and out of the cartridge faster. So you want to make sure that your hand speed is faster as well and that they are matching. If the speed between your hand and your machine are not matching, you will cause micro tears in your client's skin, and this can lead to more trauma. So if you're having issues with swelling while you're tattooing, this could be one of the reasons. I often see other people asking artists online, what speed do you use? And you should take this answer with a grain of salt, because unless you are using the exact same machine that the person is using, it's gonna be completely irrelevant. And the reason is because if you're working on the same speed with a short stroke machine versus a long stroke machine, you will actually be working faster with the short stroke machine, and it'll be depositing pigment quicker. And this is because the needle has to travel a shorter distance in and out of the gun before hitting the skin again. That being said, no matter what machine you are using, the slower the machine, the closer together the pixels will be and the quicker that you will deposit pigment. And then the faster the machine is working, the more spread out and farther apart the pixels will be. So you just need to keep this in mind. And like I mentioned before, the needles that you are choosing will affect your shading. So I'm gonna be demoing a couple needles for you guys so you can see the difference in shading, also between different strokes of guns. So when you're tattooing, you wanna make sure that you are holding your gun correctly and you're positioning your body correctly. This does affect your work as well as the tools that you are using. So when you're holding your tattoo gun, the main fingers that you will be using are your index and middle finger. These are the only fingers that will be moving. Your thumb is what's going to balance. So your index finger will be in front of your gun and your middle finger will be behind. Your thumb is strictly for balance. And that is what's gonna give you that really nice like rock. I'm not even moving my thumb. I'm literally just rocking back and forth with my two fingers while I balance on my pinky. You don't wanna be right down onto your practice skin, and you're not gonna do this on your client. You're not gonna lean on them. You wanna be balanced, because if you're down on your practice skin without this nice gap in between, you're gonna wanna like pull towards you, and you don't wanna be pulling. You don't want your wrist and your arm to be moving. You basically wanna be nice and positioned where your elbow is at an angle and you have a nice gap under here, and you wanna make sure that your wrist is nice and flat as well. and this will make sure that you're getting the proper movement while you're shading. It will also make sure that you're not pushing your gun into your client. If your arm is down onto your client, you're most likely going to be adding more pressure, which will just dig the pigment into their skin, like I had said before. And you want to also make sure that these little windows on the needle are facing out to like away from you, because this is going to help the flow of the pigment as you're tattooing. So you want your index finger here. You want to make sure that your middle finger is tucked behind the needle and your thumb is just holding it. You don't want to grip the tattoo gun with your thumb. It's just lightly there, because this is going to give you a nice rock. And then when you are shading, you don't want your hand directly down onto obviously your client or like the practice skin. You want to make sure that you're balancing with your pinky and you have a nice gap under here. Otherwise, you're not going to get a really good range of motion. You will more or less likely drag your tattoo gun in one movement instead of rocking it back and forth like you should be. So I've set my gun at a 4.5 voltage. It's going pretty slow, and I'm again using the 1RL Vertex needle. And how you want to check your needle length is you'll get a piece of paper towel and you can just fold it, or a cotton round, and you'll tattoo onto the paper towel, and you can see the pixels are coming out nice. If the needle length was too long, you wouldn't be seeing much pigment because the needle isn't going back far enough to grab the pigment. And if your needle length was too short, it would be pooling because it's grabbing so much pigment and basically forcing it out of the cartridge. So you want to make sure that you're seeing these pixels really nicely. Otherwise, you'll have to adjust your needle. So I'm going to show you now what it looks like shading with the Bishop wand. And I'm going to do 2 different speeds. So I'll do a 4.5 and then a 6.5 so you can see the difference in pixels. And then I will switch to a shorter stroke machine. So make sure that your hands are positioned correctly, because you want to make sure that you're getting the appropriate rock. It's almost like a pendulum. You don't want to be gripping your machine like death grip, otherwise you're not going to get the correct movement. And you want to be moving before you actually hit the skin. So that was a 4.5. Now I'm gonna show it on a 6.5. So remember, like I had mentioned before, you wanna match your hand speed. So I was going a little bit slower. Now that I've increased the speed of the gun, you want to increase your hand speed as well. So this will make sure that you're not dragging. You can see how much different that is. So now I'm gonna be using the short stroke device, and I will be using the exact same speeds. So first I'll do the 4.5 and then I will do the 6.5. So this is the slower speed. And then this is the faster speed. So remember how I had talked about in the video how shorter stroke machines will implant pigment faster, and this is because the needle doesn't have to travel as far as a distance. So this was the shorter stroke gun, and you can see that both of these were on the same speed. This was the long stroke, this was the short stroke, but the pixels for the short stroke are closer together than the long stroke machine. And same with when it was on a faster speed. These are a little bit more condensed compared to the ones on the long stroke gun. So you really want to make sure that you keep this in mind when you're asking other artists what speed are they working on. It doesn't really necessarily matter, but I just wanted to also show you what it looked like when you were shading properly on latex skin and what the different machines look like. Thank you guys for watching, and if you like this video, please subscribe so you don't miss any of my future videos. If you are interested in my online training, I will link it in the description box. Same with my Instagram, so you can go follow me on there, and I look forward to seeing you in my future videos.